All right, welcome to the recorded lecture for your hydration strategies for optimal performance. This will be a two-part lecture. It's a pretty long one overall, so we'll cut it at about halfway through, and there'll be a part two to this lecture. The things we're going to cover in this lecture include the items on this slide. We're going to get into just general function of water and understand and discuss what our water needs are on a daily basis. We'll talk about dehydration, how it affects our health, and how it affects our exercise and performance. We'll talk briefly about hyperhydration. Probably doesn't deserve a whole bullet on this slide, but it is something that we do discuss. And then we finish the discussion with various hydration strategies, how we should use sports drinks for optimum hydration. Yeah, water probably absolutely the most essential macronutrient. Restriction can lead to death in just days, right? We could go without food for weeks, maybe months, but without water, we don't last very long. So, in terms of importance to our overall health and function, yeah, it's on the top of the list. Water constitutes about 60% of our total body weight. We see two types or two categories of water that we find in our body: intracellular water, which is about 2/3 of body water, and extracellular water, about a third of our body's water is made up of extracellular water. We find that in our blood plasma, which we'll discuss also a little bit later. In terms of fluid balance, what are the factors that influence how much water our body holds onto? Well, water is nice because it can shift freely into and out of cells. It doesn't require fancy pumps and other types of diffusion methods like we discussed with other nutrients in this class. What generally dictates fluid balance are electrolyte concentrations. So we have our electrolytes: sodium, potassium, chloride, calcium. When they're present, they bring water with them wherever they go. And so they will cross concentration gradients, or they'll meet concentration gradients where if there's more salt on one side of the cell, or more sodium, it will go to the other side of the cell until an equilibrium is reached. And with that sodium comes water with it, as an example. The term "where ions go, water is sure to follow" is something good to remember. It's like, yeah, when we consume these electrolytes, our body will demand that we consume water to help keep them in balance. Some of the functions of water in our body. First, it helps regulate body temperature, and that's through sweating. We can help keep our bodies cool. You should know that mechanism anyway, but yeah, body temperature is regulated through sweat. Blood plasma is water. So basically, a major component of your blood, over half of it, is composed of plasma, which is water. And blood volume has multiple functions in the world of sport and performance, and obviously health, mostly related to cardiovascular function. When we start to lose blood plasma volume, cardiovascular performance starts to suffer, and therefore exercise performance starts to suffer. Fluid status plays a big role in nerve impulse transmission. So when we start talking about exercise performance and muscle contraction, the relationship there, and some of you are thinking, oh yeah, do muscle cramps have anything to do with dehydration? Possibly. And sometimes this nerve impulse transmission getting knocked out of balance is one of the factors contributing to muscle cramps. Fluid balance plays a role in helping maintain pH balance, which is critical for exercise performance. If pH balance gets out of whack, that could affect enzymes associated with metabolism and other factors that won't let us perform optimally. And then finally, fluid plays a role in the transport of nutrients to tissues that need it, and the transport of toxins or other waste products away from tissues or out of the body. Yeah, we have this great graphic of some of the other functions of water in the body. I'm not going to read all these little boxes to you, but as you can guess, water is critically important for pretty much all normal physiological function in some way or another. This slide discusses fluid needs. And so if we take a closer look, we have two columns here. On the left side, we have normal fluid needs, which is maybe not normal, but on a day where we aren't performing exercise at high intensity for long duration, or it isn't incredibly humid outside. We see fluid loss through sweat, through our feces, through our skin and lungs. So when we ventilate the lungs, the air that we breathe gets humidified. That costs us water, so that is where water is lost in that way. And then urine making up about a pretty major component of it, looks to be about 60% or so of normal fluid losses. On days where it's excessively hot and humid and you're exercising high amounts, any combination of those three things, you'll see our total urine output, instead of being about 2.5 liters, can get anywhere up to 11.5 liters. 12 liters is right about 3 gallons, just as a reference. Clearly, we can lose or will lose a lot more fluid through sweat during those conditions. That's for body temperature regulation. The other factors aren't affected as greatly. Through the skin and lungs, we do lose a lot, and that's a little bit different than, so the lungs is where most of that 3 liters comes from. That 3 liters with increased respiration, that's increased humidification of air, we will lose a lot of water through that process. What changes most dramatically on the other end is that we do urinate a lot less during these conditions. We are sacrificing water for other things, therefore we don't have as much in excess to dedicate to urine. Those are pretty realistic numbers, generally speaking. They're definitely not out of the norm. The bullet on the top there, in terms of fluid needs, a tool that I use and some of you might have used for your recent meal planning project, when we try and calculate fluid needs per day, I like to use 1 milliliter per kilocalorie expended per day. So if you're an individual who's burning in the neighborhood of 3,000 calories, also realistic value for most people, you should be consuming about 3,000 milliliters or 3 liters of fluid. That would help satisfy, at least on the left side, of normal conditions for water needs. On the right side, if you only consume 3 liters on that day, you would be in a pretty severe fluid deficit, or probably more appropriately termed dehydration. So factors affecting hydration needs, pretty obvious stuff, generally speaking. The environment is probably the biggest one. So temperature and humidity are huge factors that affect how much water we need. And they really affect how much water we lose, and therefore, the more we lose, the more we need to consume. Acclimatization of the athlete. So depending on those situations, so when we get more acclimated to hot and humid conditions, our fluid needs actually decrease a little bit, and it's not because we are not sweating as much. It's actually the opposite. Once we get acclimated to, let's say, hot and humid conditions, during that acclimation phase, we're drinking a lot more, and our body will hold on to more water. And so when it gets hot and humid out, we'll gain a couple of pounds in weight just because we're holding on to a little bit of extra water to use for sweat. But once we get acclimated, then we're going to kind of be in this fluid balance situation. So if the athlete's just getting used to the heat and humidity, they may be drinking more, or they may need to drink more to make up for the body trying to become a little bit more of a sponge to deal with those hot and humid conditions. Going up to high altitude increases hydration needs for multiple reasons. We're ventilating a lot more. High altitude air tends to be a lot drier. When we exercise at the same intensity at altitude tends to be a lot more stressful to our bodies, and we tend to sweat more and do other things that at sea level we wouldn't do. So there's multiple factors at altitude causing an increased need for fluids. Fitness level of the athlete, the less fit an individual is, the more likely they are to be sweating more for a given exercise intensity compared to someone who is better acclimated. And there's some ifs and what ifs and that kind of stuff with that statement. But generally speaking, the unfit individual most likely will have greater fluid needs. Exercise intensity and duration, that's a no-brainer. The longer you exercise and the harder you exercise, the more you're going to need. And then there may be some nutritional related factors as well. Individuals who consume a lot of electrolytes or even a lot of other types of supplements may require increased fluid to help flush them out or to help at least maintain electrolyte and other nutrient balances. I'm going to introduce the term osmolality here. We've mentioned it at least once this semester, and we're going to talk about it quite a bit later on in this discussion as well. The osmolality is a term that refers to the concentration of a fluid mixture, and I often refer to it as the mud factor. Right? Mud is made up of water and sand. The osmolality is how much sand is in a given volume of water. The more sand that's in there, the higher the osmolality. So the things that we find in fluid mixtures in our body, we'll have electrolytes, we'll have macronutrients, right? Carbohydrates in a mixture will affect its osmolality. So anything that was dissolved in fluids in our body contributes to its osmolality. The human body has sort of a homeostasis or homeostatic range of osmolality that lies somewhere between 280 and 300 milliosmolar per liter. That's what that MOSM per liter means. The body, like other things that go on, likes to keep a good regulation of osmolality of our fluids. So just like body temperature, just like blood glucose, right? The body tries to keep things in that 280 to 300 range. So when we see a situation where osmolality drops, which means our fluids are becoming, there's less things dissolved in fluids, right? So the loss of osmolality means the things are getting thinner, so to speak. The mud isn't as thick. So loss of electrolytes or consumption of excess water will cause a decrease in osmolality. The effect of that decrease in osmolality is that we lose thirst. The body's like, hey, stop the intake of fluids because our osmolality is below 280, and increase urine production. So let's get rid of some of this excess fluid to concentrate our body's fluid concentrations, concentrate our body's fluids, to get osmolality back up to where it needs to be. Conversely, if we see an increase in osmolality, and so that's if we are losing a lot of fluids, and therefore it's almost like if you have your mud and you just take the water out of the mud, the more water you lose, the thicker that mud gets. So we're losing fluids, possibly through sweat or other things, or we're consuming somehow, getting more things to dissolve into the fluid, so we're consuming a lot of electrolytes or carbohydrates or whatever it might be. In situations where osmolality goes up, our thirst will go up, we'll get thirsty, and urine production will stop because we don't want to lose any more fluid. We want osmolality to come back to where it was previously, and back to that homeostatic place. That brings us to thirst. So we mentioned thirst previously and how it's associated with osmolality. Thirst is primarily driven by osmolality. The goal of thirst, the reason you get thirsty, is to maintain that osmolality. Just like if we talked about blood sugar and hunger, if you have really low blood sugar, you're going to get hungry to bring that blood sugar back up. Once blood sugar is back up, hunger goes away. Thirst is similar in that relationship. We get thirsty because osmolality has probably gone up and we need to dilute it, right? We need to get some more fluids in. So thirst as a general mechanism is not a reliable tool for replacing sweat volume. So if you're exercising and you're sweating a lot and you just drink to thirst only, you probably won't replace all your sweat. And that's not absolutely critical for performance, but under certain circumstances, it can cause some problems. So research done on using thirst as a tool to replace sweat, and this is done on water. This is not using electrolyte or carbohydrate solutions. We typically voluntarily replace about 40 to 60% of the sweat we lost. Water is a bit tricky. Water decreases osmolality very quickly. And so if we use water as a tool to replace sweat, osmolality actually drops quite rapidly, and the thirst mechanism gets turned off. And research done using other types of beverages, which we'll talk about later in this discussion, are a little bit more effective at replacing what we lose in terms of sweat. For most individuals, the sensation of thirst appears after about a 1 to 2% dehydration. And I'll talk about how we measure dehydration in a minute. Got a little bit ahead of ourselves, but 1 to 2% dehydration is losing 1 to 2% of your body weight from fluid loss. So we get thirsty. If you're a 150-pound person, you lose 1.5 pounds. that would be 1% of your body weight. You lose 1.5 pounds of sweat, then you start to get thirsty. Seems like a lot, I know, but that's the thirst mechanism. It takes a little while to kick in, but once it kicks in, you better listen to it. Uh, the performance implications of that is there are certain people and certain types of activities where even a 1 to 2% dehydration may affect performance. And so it's quite often argued, and it used to be argued even harder, that yeah, you shouldn't wait till you get thirsty, because by the time you get thirsty, you're already being affected by dehydration and performance might already be suffering. And there's some truth to that, not a lot of truth to it. And generally speaking, we can tolerate a 1 to 2% dehydration in most types of activities and be fine. And we got into trouble, not we personally, but the American College of Sports Medicine got into trouble. So sort of our field, I guess, got into trouble probably about 15 years ago now, where based on research done that showed that, yeah, thirst doesn't occur until 2% dehydration. That may affect performance. They had recommendations to drink a certain amount of fluid, even if you weren't thirsty. And what it ended up leading to is a lot of people over drinking, which we'll talk about later in this discussion. They've changed their stance, and they do say now drink to thirst for optimum performance and safety. Again, we'll address those things specifically a little bit later on. I put children and older populations down there for a reason. Those are populations that don't quite have the same control over thirst that sort of people outside of those populations have. Children, their thirst mechanism is fine, but what children often lack is the ability to communicate or act on that thirst. And so, you take a 1-year-old who can't talk yet. Sometimes it's not easy for a 1-year-old to tell you that they're thirsty. Or you get even younger than 1-year-old, right? So even infants, I should have put on there, not so much children. But so children are very susceptible to getting dehydrated, not because they don't get thirsty, but just because they can't act on that thirst. Like I said, a 1-year-old can't go make themselves a glass of water as easily as others. Older populations do actually lose a bit of the thirst mechanism. And so older individuals, whether they're not getting thirsty or they just don't act on that thirst, are more susceptible to dehydration just because they don't respond to the signals, or the signals aren't coming in. So what happens if we ignore thirst? Well, pretty obvious, right? We get dehydrated. So it leads to a shortage of water in the body. And so the body will respond, right? And so if thirst gets ignored, osmolality goes up, and the body's like, okay, we're giving you the signals that would help us get osmolality back to where it needs to be. We're gonna act with the release of a couple of hormones. Of course, there's hormones involved, right? So the body responds by releasing a few hormones. One of them is called antidiuretic hormone. This is released by the pituitary gland, and it essentially just stops the kidneys from producing urine. And so it forces the kidneys to conserve water. And so instead of a certain volume of fluid going through the kidneys being converted to urine, it goes right through and back into the bloodstream. The other hormone is aldosterone. This actually is a hormone that responds to the drop in blood pressure associated with the loss of fluid volume. And so when we start to get dehydrated, a lot of the fluid that we lose is coming from our blood plasma. And so we have a drop in blood pressure when we get dehydrated. That release of aldosterone also signals the kidney to get conservative. In this case, it tells the kidneys to hold on to sodium. So instead of eliminating sodium through the urine or other processes, it holds on to sodium. And like we talked about earlier, sodium, that electrolyte, will help keep water in the body. So there's sort of a two-pronged hormonal approach of dealing with dehydration or ignoring thirst. Yes, so how do we know if we're dehydrated, right? I've been talking about it for quite a bit now. What are the tools that we can use to establish whether or not dehydration has occurred? So the general strategy for most individuals is still, and it's been under some criticism, this technique, by some really good scientists, and I agree with what they say, but I still think this is our best tool, and it ends up maybe making it so we drink a little bit more than we need to, but most people don't follow the rules anyway. So this strategy, dehydration, is roughly quantified by the amount of body weight lost. This next sentence, one should consider fuel use in this equation, and this is where some people get kind of nitty-gritty and start splitting hairs. But if you're exercising, you could be burning anywhere from 0.2 pounds to half a pound of body weight from carbohydrates and fats, right? So the energy that you're breaking your carbs and fats down through metabolism to get ATP, you could be burning through, about up to half a pound of energy from them. Keeping in mind that the end product of burning carbohydrates and fats in the body is the production of water. So are we actually losing a half a pound of carbohydrates, or are we just converting that carbohydrate into water, which would actually be a bonus? So don't worry about that too much. The way we measure dehydration is we take our pre-exercise weight, assuming that our pre-exercise weight we're normally hydrated, pre-exercise weight minus post-exercise weight, take that difference, divide it by total body weight, that gives you percent dehydration. So the example on the screen, if you weigh 70 kgs, that's somewhere about 150 pounds. Before exercise, you weigh yourself after exercise, you weigh 68.5 kgs. Of course, you can do this in pounds. But you lose a kilogram and a half of body weight during an exercise session. So you divide 1.5 by 70, multiply by 100, that gives you 2.1% dehydration. That's very, very realistic in terms of a number based on exercise. So that's how we calculate dehydration. So we talk about dehydration as a percent body weight loss most frequently. There are other ways to do it. Some people like to use urine-specific gravity tests, and so you can pee into a device that tells you how concentrated your urine is. That is a useful way to measure dehydration. So the drawback of that is, it takes equipment, or I think they have strips now that you can use, but they cost money. It's a little bit clunky of a process. Others use urine color. And so we have this color chart on the left of the screen here. Normal hydration is sort of the 1, 2, and 3 colored urine. As we start to get progressively more dehydrated, apparently your urine could look like a cup of coffee, which would be that number 8. That would be very dehydrated. So there is a relationship between the color, the strength of color of our urine and dehydration. But as you already know from our vitamin and mineral talk, there's also effects of certain supplements and foods that can affect the color of our urine. So the urine color can sometimes be misleading, but it is also a useful tool. None of the tools we have are perfect necessarily. So as we get more dehydrated, here's a list of some of the common symptoms that we could experience, not necessarily during exercise. These are sort of resting symptoms, but from a 1 to 2% dehydration. So I'm following these numbers down from the top. Up to about 2% dehydration, increased thirst, maybe a little loss of appetite, possibly a little discomfort. I know for me, and I know some people have it as well, my ears start to get hot. I'm like, oh, my ears are getting hot. I must be dehydrated. It's a very interesting thing, but it's pretty consistent with me. And I imagine that happens to me at about that 2%. Not sure. As we get progressively more dehydrated, the symptoms start to get a little bit more serious. At from 3 to 5%, we see things in terms of some cognitive impairment, difficulty concentrating. We get nausea. We might get a little bit of tingling in our extremities, right? So we start to see some more serious symptoms the more dehydrated we get. Getting to 6% dehydrated, that to me is a real red flag, and people should not ever get that dehydrated, but especially not exercise at that point. So you could see, that as dehydration gets more severe, the symptoms do as well. So how do we get dehydrated? Well, you have a couple of choices. You're either not drinking enough, you're sweating too much, or both. And it's usually a combination of those things, but it does depend. So we have Surfer Joe here to help illustrate this concept of dehydration. And I'll quite often argue that during certain conditions, it's almost impossible not to get dehydrated. So those conditions involve exercise and they involve heat. And so when it's hot and you're exercising, losses of sweat in most people and can range anywhere from half a liter all the way to 3 liters per hour. So if you're one of those heavy sweaters, sweater, right? If you are a heavy sweater, you lose a lot of fluids when you train, you could be close to 3 liters an hour of sweat loss. And I've worked out with people and counseled people that are in that zone. So 3 liters is not unheard of, for sure. zero point 0.5 liters is lower intensity exercise, maybe not as hot outside, or some of you are just very stingy in terms of sweating. It's like, oh, I never sweat. It's like, and by the way, heavy sweating is a positive adaptation to exercise. People who sweat more are able to control their body temperature better. So in terms of using our Surfer Joe example here, that little glass of water represents 1 liter of fluid. So let's say Surfer Joe lost 3 liters of fluid in an hour, and he was playing whatever he was playing. Surely some sort of beach volleyball had to be, right? He lost 3 liters an hour, and he played his beach volleyball for a little while. We'll talk about that in a second. So in terms of maximum fluid absorption, humans on average can absorb about 1.2 liters per hour of fluid. So if you drank 2 liters of fluid in 1 hour, right? So 2 big old water bottles, right? 2 of those in 1 hour, only about 1.2 of those liters would have gotten absorbed through the small intestine into your body. About 0.8 of that would still probably be sloshing around in your stomach a little bit, and maybe some in your intestines. So really, we have a maximum rate of fluid absorption, which is very much a limiting factor. So maximum fluid absorption, about 1.2 liters per hour, represented by that little glass of water there. It's not perfect. So let's say Surfer Joe does his beach volleyball for 3 hours, which means in this case he loses 9 liters of water, and he's doing his very best to stay on top of hydration needs, and so he drinks 3 liters, or he absorbs the full 3 liters of fluid over those 3 hours. I know the math isn't perfect, but I have to use these glasses. So what is the potential after 3 hours of beach volleyball for Surfer Joe? Possibly a 6-liter dehydration. And then the average individual, 150-pound individual, that would be about a 10% dehydration. That's insane. And that's very extreme, but it is very doable under some circumstances. Most likely, if Surfer Joe was sweating 3 liters an hour, he would probably have stopped exercise during that second hour. He could have made it through the first hour pretty well, and then that second hour, the dehydration would have started to really kick in. So 10% dehydration is actually quite dramatic and quite severe. So this is one of those sort of, I call it extreme, but it's not unrealistic and it's not that extreme. Dehydration can be inevitable in these types of circumstances. So the consequences of this type of dehydration, we start to lose the ability to dissipate heat, which means our ability to cool our body is lost. It means our internal organs start to get really hot, and we do not like that. This affects metabolism, this affects cognitive function, it affects everything. Generally speaking, this dehydration will affect substrate utilization, which means we start converting to using carbohydrates as an energy source instead of fats. Not a big deal, but for sporting competition reasons, sometimes that is a big deal. The loss of blood volume affects cardiovascular function dramatically. We see fluctuations in blood pressure because of it. We have a decrease in oxygen delivery to the tissues. We have an increase in heart rate for a given exercise intensity, and we're less able to remove waste. We're not producing any more urine, so waste products are going to be circulating around for quite a while. I'd say this severe of a dehydration, you've probably stopped sweating at this point, so your body starts to get really stingy. Yeah, so some more real life examples, I guess. So this is just a marathon example. So a 3-hour marathon, and you're sweating at 1.5 liters an hour. So you're in the mid-range of sweating. So you're doing the marathon and 80-degree weather, so not too hot, not too cold kind of thing. If you didn't consume any fluids during that marathon, some people try that, you'd lose about 4.5 liters, so about 10 pounds of weight. In a 160-pound person, that would be about a 6% dehydration. That would not be good, and that would definitely affect performance the last handful of miles of that marathon. Let's say, though, you're that same individual, but you maximize fluid absorption. And so you go 3 times 1.2 liters per hour during the race. And I put that in bold because it's not easy to drink 1.5 liters when you're running. Cycling is a whole different animal, but when you're running, for those of you runners out there, 1.5 liters per hour while you're running is uncomfortable usually. So, but let's say you're really good at it. So you consumed your 1.2 liters per hour. That gets you up to 3.6 liters during the race. That 4.5 liter dehydration plus the 3.6 liters replaced still led to, or would lead to, about a 0.9 liter dehydration, which is about 2 pounds. So in a 160-pound person, that's about a 1.2% dehydration. And that's realistic, right? In the ballpark of that. The average fluid loss from a marathon, they do research on this, is about 2 kilograms. So, our little fake math here is a little bit off, but because I think it is hard to drink that much during a race. So we see this pretty commonly. It's hard for people during a race like a marathon to maintain hydration. That average fluid loss of about 2 kgs probably didn't affect performance much, maybe towards the end of exercise just a little bit. All right, so we're going to hit up dehydration and health, and then we'll take a break. So stay with me. So dehydration and health. So when we start to look at these physical effects of dehydration, there are some categories, and you've probably covered these in some of your other classes, of some dehydration-related health issues. So when we look at dehydration, up to about 3%, dehydration, firstly, does not cause overheating. And so that's really important to note for this conversation. There is definitely a relationship to people who overheat and the possibility of them being dehydrated because we start to lose the ability to dissipate heat through sweat. However, the overheating is caused by exercise intensity. So the harder you're exercising, the more heat's being generated by your muscles. And because we're very inefficient when we use our muscles, the harder we exercise, the more heat is lost through that. So exercise intensity, or metabolism associated with exercise intensity, is what determines the rise in core temperature. This is an important bullet at the very end there. I'll mention again in a few slides. Athletes will slow down or stop before temperature gets to critical levels. In other words, if we're not severely dehydrated and we're exercising, the body will recognize that it's starting to overheat, and we have our brain saying, you know what, it's starting to get hot, and we will slow down to therefore decrease the amount of heat being produced and therefore preventing a catastrophic overheating. That being said, the conversation of dehydration and heat-related illnesses in our field is always overlapping, meaning that, oh yeah, we're talking about dehydration. Well, was it heat-related illness because of the dehydration? So I share this information with you guys just so you're informed. Dehydration and overheating are not the same thing. So heat-related illnesses, though, I do feel like I should share a couple slides that talk about them. There's a progression of heat-related illnesses that are described here on the left: heat cramps, heat exhaustion, heat stroke. The degree of severity, least, moderate, and highest. Signs and symptoms definitely get more severe, right? So heat cramps, muscle cramping due to dehydration. We mentioned it at the onset of this discussion. Yeah, muscle cramps and hydration status can be related. So does heat in and of itself cause muscle cramps? No, not at all. That means like every time you're in the shower or bathtub or every time it's hot outside, you're going to get cramps? No. So again, this overlap of heat-related illnesses and dehydration is interesting. Heat exhaustion. So the term heat exhaustion is when some of these signs and symptoms start to get a little bit more severe. And so these are individuals who start to sweat profusely. They get cold and clammy skin, even though it's hot outside and they're exercising hard. They may feel lightheaded or dizzy. They may have a very high pulse. They may have very low blood pressure. Heat stroke is definitely, and if you look at the far right here, you have some corrective actions. Heat stroke is definitely a 911 situation. Sweating has stopped. Individuals lose coordination of their muscles, so they're not only not able to do normal movements, but they start to lose control of their bowel movements. They're disoriented. Sometimes they pass out. Definitely very, very severe. Here's the same slide kind of showing the same information. Going from left to right, we have heat cramps all the way to heat stroke and kind of the warning signs of each. And, there isn't absolute categories. And so I like this demonstration or presentation of the symptoms a little bit better than the previous slides. So as things get more severe towards heat stroke, you see these more serious symptoms. So as much as dehydration can be a challenge for individuals and athletes, drinking is sometimes a really easy remedy for that, in addition to stopping exercise, right? And we're usually pretty good at preventing things from getting overly dangerous. On the flip side, overhydration or over drinking is an issue that also faces a lot of athletes. And so, this quote from Dr. Tim Noakes: over drinking is not only unnecessary to maintain thermoregulation, but it could also put people at risk for hyponatremic encephalopathy, which is basically swelling of the brain or water in the brain. Um, and so, this idea of having to overdrink or forcing people to overdrink, which I mentioned earlier in this talk too, it's like, yeah, forcing people to drink when they don't have to can lead to some problems. And hyponatremia is when concentrations of sodium in the body get too low, and that causes some potentially very severe symptoms. So hyponatremia, so serum sodium concentrations below the normal range. So the body's normal range for sodium is 135 to 145 millimole per liter. Symptoms appear when serum sodium drops below about 130. And so early symptoms of hyponatremia: bloating, puffiness, and so people start to look bloated and puffy, right? Internally, they feel nauseated, vomiting, and they get headaches. Unfortunately, and the reason that those three are highlighted in red, those three symptoms mirror very much what some of those symptoms of heat exhaustion and heat stroke have, right? And so there are situations, documented situations of individuals thinking that they're overheating. And so they keep drinking more water. They keep drinking more water, more water, more water. They start to get hyponatremic and start to get these symptoms of nausea, vomiting, and headache. And instead of stopping the drinking, which is absolutely what they should be doing, they keep drinking, and it gets even more hyponatremic, and they could die from it. And there's been cases where people have died thinking that they were actually not hydrating enough. They had heat stroke or heat exhaustion, so they just kept drinking. So later symptoms do include other overlapping symptoms with the opposite, so the heat stroke kind of stuff, with confusion, disorientation, seizures, those types of things. How does this happen? Well, other than the example I gave you, yeah, people get diligent about drinking. And so in longer exposure types of scenarios, some people just drink water. And if you're drinking water, water doesn't have any electrolytes in it, doesn't have anything in it. So the osmolality of water is zero. And so if you're drinking something with the osmolality of zero, when it gets into your body, it's going to dilute the osmolality of all your fluids, which means from that 280 to 300 range of osmolality, things are going to start to drop. And the more you drink water, the more they drop. And so your body's going to start urinating as much as possible. You might even sweat more because of it, which are all good adaptations. But if you don't stop drinking, then things can kind of go crazy. So there's been research done on hyponatremia. And so we have three sort of race situations on this slide. The Western States Endurance Run, which is very local. It's very cool. I've been on that trail. I've done the trail, just not running because that's just insane. Western States Endurance Run is a 100-mile run in the Sierra Nevadas. Lots of elevation gain, lots of heat exposure, lots of very, very challenging terrain. They found that 30% of the participants, this is research done back in 2011, 30% of the participants had symptomless hyponatremia, which means, yeah, their plasma sodium concentration was below 135, but they weren't showing the symptoms of the bloatedness, the puffiness, and those other signs and symptoms. So that's a fair amount, right? So we had 30%, that's, 1 in 3 basically, participants in that race having low sodium concentrations. A handful of studies done over in Europe by Swiss researchers. The first was done, and there's a collection of different races done on swimmers, cyclists, and runners. And these are all ultra distance events, so you can assume they're all over 8 hours, and a lot of them were 24-hour races. The percentages of individuals that had signs and symptoms or that were measured at being hyponatremic: 13, 10, 5%, 8%, about 6% overall in the research done by that group of researchers. These numbers do match with what have been found in marathon and Ironman athletes in the USA. Also, Swiss researchers looked at 24-hour ultra marathon. I think is a 161-mile or kilometer run, so 100-mile run. No reports of hyponatremia in that group of 15. Losses of 2.2 kilograms, so it's about 5 pounds. But serum sodium concentrations remained unchanged. And so what these athletes did is consumed about 0.8 liters per hour of an electrolyte carbohydrate solution. And so that was there to help match their losses of sodium, so things didn't change. And so that becomes a key later on in this discussion. The treatment of hyponatremia, well, if possible, intravenous sodium, so saline solution right off the bat. So that's not always possible. So stop drinking, take electrolytes with as little water as possible. Even consuming just straight salt can actually help. Or mix it with just a little bit of water. It tastes gross, but it increases osmolality. That's what we're dealing with. A drop in osmolality. So it's best to avoid it. So not forcing yourself to drink water is the best strategy. Choose beverages with some electrolytes. Sports drinks are adequate. I mean, that's what sports drinks should be designed for. They all have different levels. We'll talk about that in the next half of this discussion. So last slide before we end this first half, hyperhydration. So is there a way for us to hold on to more fluids without causing this situation of hyponatremia? And there is. And the term hyperhydrating is the term used to describe this increased holding on to water by individuals. There's different ways to do it. We've talked about carbohydrate loading. That is a way to increase water status of an individual. That water is mostly dedicated to helping us store carbohydrates. Even consumption of creatine as a supplement will do so. More specifically, there are sodium and glycerol-based protocols that individuals will take either a lot of salt or a lot of a product called glycerol to increase their body's ability to hold on to water. Consuming excess salt has some advantages. It's pretty easily tolerated in terms of taste. It's not great, but it's not horrible. But sodium will only help us hold on to water for in the neighborhood of like 2 to 4 hours. So you can have something really salty and you're like, oh, I'm thirsty. You're going to drink some fluids. And within 2 to 4 hours, you're going to pee all that extra fluid out. Unless you're exercising, then it could be helpful there. Glycerol is a little bit different. Glycerol is a sugar alcohol, and it is actually used in cosmetic products quite a bit because it has a very strong osmotic pull, which means it's very hyperosmolar and it brings water with it. And it pulls water even tighter or strong. It's almost a stronger magnet for water than sodium is, or it is. And when individuals consume glycerol mixed with adequate amount of water, urine production, and so hydration status remains elevated for upwards of 8 to 12 hours. And so I worked with a couple of research projects in New Mexico with the U.S. military to see if soldiers using glycerol could stay at a higher level of hydration when they're in places like Afghanistan where it's insanely hot and they're wearing tons of gear for 24 hours at a time. And the research was really promising in terms of using glycerol to help the body hold on to fluids without messing with sodium or osmolality, basically, so without becoming hyponatremic. In terms of sport performance, the research isn't great. And one of the things is, you're going to be holding on to all this extra water. You're going to weigh more. So is weighing more of benefit? For athletes, that's more of an important question to ask. For the soldiers, that was a no-brainer. It's like, they'd rather be 3 or 4 pounds heavier just to not get so dehydrated when they're exposed to the elements that they're exposed to. So, all right, that is it for this first half of the talk. Check out the next half.